Welcome to today's Corporate Secretary webinar, How Proactive Governance Can Protect You, Your Board, Your Company, and Your Brand, brought to you in association with Laurel Hill Advisory Group. I am Matthew Scott, the editor of Corporate Secretary Magazine, and I will be your host and moderator. This event is one of a series of Corporate Secretary Executive Briefing webinars. Please check our website, corporatesecretary.com, for more details on future webinars and other Corporate Secretary events. Today we have more than 200 people from around the globe that have registered for this event. That's important because our panel will be taking questions from the audience. If you have a question for our panel, please submit it at any time during the webinar by typing into the question box that should be available on your screen. There will not be any slide presentations during today's 30-minute broadcast, but we will conduct 2 audience polls during the discussion. When I announce the poll, please click on the appropriate box for your selections and hit the Submit button to have your responses recorded. And now, our speakers for today's webinar, How Proactive Governance Can Protect You, Your Board, Your Company, and Your Brand, are Francis Bird, the Senior Vice President and Corporate Governance Risk Practice Leader of Laurel Hill Advisory Group, and Ning Chu, Counsel at the law firm of David, Polk & Wardell. Welcome, Francis and Ning.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
This proxy season has suddenly turned volatile, with a number of significant shareholder actions sending warning shots at the boards of publicly traded companies in the U.S. Recently, we've seen mighty Goldman Sachs being pressured to change parts of its board structure. Citigroup shareholders rejected the company's executive compensation plan, and this morning, General Electric shareholders received a 47.5% vote on a measure that would have given investors the right to push through corporate changes without calling a special meeting. It appears the shareholders are looking to exercise greater control of companies in a number of fronts, and boards are certainly feeling the pressure. So let's start our discussion with say-on-pay. Francis, what should companies do to avoid a say-on-pay no vote this year, similar to what happened with Citibank?
Well, I think what companies need to do, what boards need to do, there are a couple of things. They need to assess and take the temperature on their compensation plans, either immediately after the board has approved them or before the board approves them, so that they have an idea of what shareholders might have problems with, and that way they can try and make some first-level adjustments. They also companies need to try and engage both ISS and Glass Lewis in some way prior to the release of the proxy. There are ways to do that, to have conversations with the proxy advisory firms, particularly ISS, in part because it's the largest and also because it's easier to have a more general conversation, not necessarily specific in depth on comp. And then the last thing that they need to do is they need to know and understand and identify both who their shareholders are and who is actually doing the voting on say-on-pay and other comp issues at their investors. And if they do those 3 things and they engage those particular communities, I think that they'll find that the votes will not be as problematic, or at least they'll be able to surface some of the problems a little bit earlier in the process.
So Ning, in terms of what some of your clients are doing, are there any strategies that you're seeing them adapt concerning dealing with say-on-pay votes this year?
You know, following up on what Francis has just said and going along with the theme that we're trying to convey during this call is being proactive, being protective, and I completely agree with Francis in sort of just identifying issues up front, knowing when you might have a problem. Sometimes because you are at the company and, you know, not everybody's externally focused, especially when it comes to an issue like comp, and you may not realize what the reaction will be when you put out those numbers. So that's a key part of being prepared, like Francis said, is just recognizing when you might have a problem. Another strategy is just making sure that the people involved know when there might be a problem. Sometimes there's a little bit of a concern with being the person who's going to be the bearer of the bad news or who's seen as, being negative about things. And sometimes problems don't rise to a level where they can be dealt with if nobody raises them at that level. Some of the reactions that people are focused on once they are having an issue, which is generally having the proxy advisory services recommend against you, is considering whether to file additional soliciting materials. We're not seeing as many as we did last year because companies were more prepared and this year put more information in their proxy statements to begin with to address what some of the criticisms may be. But we are generally seeing some still. And there's a question about whether you should have them and do you want to add new information in, or is it just a really good way for you to put more succinctly your comp story on 1 or 2 pages. And some people believe that the investors may need this information to have a reason to vote against the advisor's recommendation. So there are definitely considerations for whether or not you want to do one. It doesn't make sense for everybody, and you don't always have to do it. And that's another key to sort of being proactive, being protective, is recognizing the special circumstances of your own company. Shareholder engagement is, of course, absolutely key. Knowing who your shareholders are, knowing what their voting policies are, knowing how to engage with them.
Okay. Obviously, say on pay is a major concern for investors, for companies this year. And but we want to find out from our audience what their most concerns are, what their biggest concerns are this proxy season. So we are going to pull up the first polling question. The first polling question is, what are you most concerned about this proxy season? And you'll see it come up in a few moments on your screen. The answers are say on pay votes, director elections, shareholder proposals, proxy access, succession planning and disclosure, political contribution and lobbying disclosures, or you don't have any major concerns. So for those of you who see on your screen, you can see the box to make your selections. I'm going to give you a chance to actually go ahead and do that, and give you a little bit more time.
The live feedback is really useful.
Yes, and so we're going to broadcast the results now. Let's see what our audience is thinking. Okay, it seems like say on pay is one of the major concerns, is the major concern of our audience out here.
Francis, I don't know what you think, but I don't think that's a surprise because given the state of the economy right now and that the stock prices and the concerns over the continuing economic downturn, there are a lot of companies with sort of not as great shareholder returns as they would like to have had who still have to continue to pay management, and so their TSR and other quantitative numbers don't quite work out the way either the shareholders or proxy advisory services would like to have them. And so, yes, I agree that the sentiment expressed in the poll is consistent with what we're saying, which is say on pay is probably, at the moment, the primary concerns.
I absolutely agree with that. I think it certainly is a concern. I think it's probably the primary concern of, if not certainly most of the folks listening to us, I think they accurately represent the majority of folks who are working at companies. I would say that there are certainly there's a sleeper issue in there, and that's probably the last one. And I think we might get an opportunity to talk about the succession planning and disclosure bit. But all of these are issues that can come up and become problematic for a company at some point, not just during the annual meeting season, but at other points during the course of the year in a company's life.
One comment I'd make about director elections being an issue, and this is actually very much in keeping with the spirit of being proactive and being protective. There are many things that will cause a director election problem that people can try to at least watch out for in advance. One, director attendance issues, the director being on too many boards, affiliated or related party transaction relationships, that could be criticized and could cause an issue for the director elections. And a lot of those, if you are just aware of them and prepare for them, then you can at least get people up to speed on them before you put out your proxy and then have to react. Even though you may not be able to do anything about the fact that there might be a problem, at least you can prepare people internally and have an action plan on how you're going to react once it becomes public and once you are criticized and there is an issue.
Okay, we're going to move past the first polling question and move on to our second topic, which is proxy access. It's a big issue this season. And Ning, we'll start with you. What are some key issues you're noticing about proxy access proposals and how some of your clients are starting to approach and attack that issue?
It's been very interesting to see what's happened to proxy access this season. I think before the start of the season, a lot of people would have said this was the issue for the season, but there's been a lot of developments with SEC and the courts, and now we are facing it as a shareholder proposal issue, like many other shareholder proposals. This one obviously has more bite than some other shareholder proposals. Right now, I think what we're looking at is about over 10 pending proposals at different companies, and Wells Fargo, I think, was the first, and that proposal failed. What companies, I think, are doing at the moment is developing more of a wait-and-see approach, in part because it's unclear the appropriate level of ownership and holding period that a majority of shareholders would like to see, and there are some questionable benefits to having a first-mover approach. I think Francis is going to talk rightly about, how to avoid being a target. But one thing that at the moment is it's sort of still an incubator issue, and, companies don't want to overreact any more than they want to underreact to any particular issue. So this is very much still an area where everybody's keeping an eye on.
I would agree with that entirely, but I'll go a little bit further in my comments in a different way, which is talking about some of the factors that could make a company a target for a proxy access proposal. And there are two groups that are doing proxy access very simply. There are the governance advocates, the large institutional investors. Those are the New York Cities, the CalSTRS, Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, those sorts of pension funds. There's the Norges Bank proposals that were the one that was defeated at Wells Fargo, and they have at least 4 others out there as well. And then there are the individual retail shareholders through the U.S. Shareholders Exchange that have many proposals out there as well at different companies to the extent they haven't been knocked out. So I think if a company has found itself with it has ignored a majority vote by shareholders on corporate governance issues, on an executive pay issue, and I mean a large executive pay issue, not something that's really sort of small about a particular tax treatment or an incentive plan that didn't go or didn't get a positive recommendation from ISS or Glass Lewis, but a series of problems like ignoring a classified board, a vote to repeal classified board, ignoring right to call special meeting or act by written consent. Those sorts of issues where companies have butted heads with shareholders, ignored majority votes, that's the sort of thing, and then has a large executive comp problem similar to either what's happened, say, at Chesapeake Energy or at Neighbors, where you see coalitions or individual institutional investors deciding to file proxy access proposals because they feel, well, this is a company that deserves a proxy access proposal. But if you have had a small problem with a proxy advisor or you have a smaller problem with an individual shareholder, it may not lead to the filing of a proxy access proposal. So you should understand that and not panic.
And going along with what Francis said, consistent with what his point is that you do need to recognize and understand what your issues are and the size and impact of individual issues and whether collectively they make up a problem. And in addition, you need to know who your major shareholders are and how they'll react to the issues that are causing the problem, and also how they'll react when you come knock on their door and advocate for your position. If you have a pre-existing relationship, it always helps in any instance.
Yeah, that's a good point. For companies that maybe there's somebody out there that didn't see this coming, and they're like, well, what can I do now? Is it too late to do anything, or are there some specific proactive things or last-ditch effort things even that companies should start to look at when they're talking about either proxy access issues or stay-on-pay issues?
Well, I think that if you're talking about proxy access, the things are a little bit different. On proxy access, you need to sort of assess what your governance vulnerabilities, problems, or concerned shareholders might have, and then determine whether or not any of those are things that you can and wish to correct in order to either gain shareholder support or negotiate with the proponent and remove the proxy access proposal off the ballot. So those are your choices there, and you also have to engage with your shareholders at the same time. Tell them that you're going to be making changes, making improvements, strengthening governance in some way, listening to shareholders more, and that combination of things, and it depends on what's happening at each individual company, gives you something to talk about with your shareholders and with the proponent, either to convince them to withdraw the proposal or convince your shareholders to vote with management against the proposal.
I think it's kind of never too late up until the polls close, really, on say-on-pay. Francis touched on proxy access. I'll tackle say-on-pay because we've had some interesting conversations about. Your first reaction is to try to get it to pass, of course, and then it's sort of like going back to school and trying to get as high a grade as you can. And is there really a benefit to trying to get as high a grade as you can if you are below 70, which is what some people view as sort of a margin of safety, given the way ISS and Glass Lewis view some of these things and institutions view some of these things as to where you are in the safe zone. So if you're going to be below 70 and you get yourself above 50, does every single percentage point then start to count? And the thing is, I'm not sure that you have to look at the numbers that technically, but I think it's always worthwhile to the extent that there are issues to talk with your investors about it. The tricky part, of course, is during this busy season, even getting your investors' attention. But if there are issues, you can kind of bet that the investors are looking at you and wondering why they're not hearing from you, if they don't hear from you, as to, do you not have anything to say to advocate for your position? So you would very much like to get your story out there because there is another story out there, the ISS and Glass Lewis story, or maybe the voting policies of your particular investors. So you want it to be a balanced consideration. You want to talk to the investors about your comp story and what you've already said in detail in your proxy, and you may think the proxy kind of stands for itself, but really there's nothing that is better than one-on-one communication because in part that having that proxy, it doesn't tell you what the investors think. And they're not necessarily going to call you and tell you when they think there's a problem. So you need to reach out, especially right now when they're all so busy. You need to reach out and be in a bit of a listening mode because even if you can't get that number very high this year, at least it prepares you for next year because this is more or less for most companies an ongoing vote.
Yeah, and I would say, and here's the thing to keep in mind in my initial comments about say-on-pay, what companies can do to prepare, it's to start early in the process. When you get to this point in the year, if you're a year-end company, you're having your annual meeting in either late March, April, May, or June, and the result is this is the busiest part of the season. It's the busiest time for folks at all of the investment firms and at the funds in terms of voting proxies, and they're not necessarily, going to have the time to be able to focus in on why they should support you over an ISIS and or Glass Lewis recommendation, why they should overlook something that their own voting guidelines may tell them they're not supposed to support, unless you try to get to them earlier. And that means you do need to study who your investors are, how they vote, what their guidelines are they heavily influenced by ISS and or by Glass Lewis, so that you have a much better understanding and then you can start to engage them much earlier in the process. And that way you have a leg up. You sort of understand what their thinking is, and it gives you the opportunity to get your plan across, get your message across, and communicate during a time when not everybody is trying to get on the phone with them and they're voting thousands of proxies at the same time.
Okay, now we're going to go to our second polling question, and I want to remind the people who have dialed in that you should look at the box that you can click on and make your selections. Our second polling question is, what have you done differently this year to talk to shareholders than you've done in the past? And our selections are made many more phone calls, held more face-to-face meetings with them, enlisted more help from proxy solicitation firms to engage them, sent more emails or electronic communication than in the past, or you haven't done anything differently. So take a few minutes and make your selections. And I also want to encourage our listeners to actually ask questions. You can type your questions in the question box, and we're going to get to those questions shortly. So take a few minutes and type in those questions. Take a few minutes and make your selection for the second polling question. And this one is coming out pretty interesting here. Numbers are still fluctuating. I'll give it a few more minutes.
It's fun to watch the fluctuating questions.
Okay, let's broadcast our results.
It looks like about roughly the same number of people either made more phone calls or haven't done anything differently, but actually it's moving a little bit. But there are, if you add up the people who've made more of an effort, done more with proxy solicitation firm, more face-to-face meetings, people who've actually taken action, then collectively that's obviously more than people who haven't done anything differently. It's just that they all did different types of things.
Yes, and that's good because people are being proactive. Now, let me ask you a question about this haven't done anything differently. A lot of people haven't done anything differently, and we're seeing some bigger movements in terms of what shareholders are able to accomplish this year. Do you think that might have something to do with some of these major changes that we've seen in the news? The fact that people haven't done anything differently, 30%.
You mean in terms of what the consequences of not doing anything differently would be?
Yes.
I think it's difficult to say because there are obviously going to be situations where no matter how much you advocate for your position and no matter how much you reach out, it's not going. The situation is such that the investors are going to be unhappy. So while we are obviously pushing for everyone to consider proactively engaging with shareholders, and it's a huge element of everything we're saying, there are some things where an issue is an issue, and the investors are going to take a stand. So it's hard to say. I think one thing that is happening, though, with what people are seeing, it is a little bit of a wake-up call that this annual meeting proxy season environment that concerns a lot of people is also of interest generally and can attract large-scale attention. I think that's actually a little bit of an interesting wake-up call, and that's actually one of the things that I would advocate for as well, which is to pay attention to the environment. The environment makes a difference. There's a lot of stuff now about 99% powers and, what's happening at some of the annual meetings. And even if you're not expecting anything like that, even if you have the quietest annual meeting ever and have had the quietest annual meeting ever, just understanding the environment, because a lot of people share the same shareholders, even if, big companies, small companies, a bunch of them, everyone has sort of the same big, large shareholders. If you understand the environment, you kind of might have a sense of what your shareholders are sensing and what your investors are looking at and how they're weighing you relative to other people. And so just being concerned with the general proxy environment, the general annual meeting environment is actually also important.
Okay, I would concur with all of that and say that that's why companies need to, from time to time, take a look at where they are, both with governance, compensation, environmental and social issues that are germane to their industry, because one day you're getting a proposal that gets usually 3% or 5%, and then the next year you get a proposal that knocks you out and goes nearly to 50%, you wonder sort of what happened, and it's because you simply missed paying super strict attention to what's going on in the environment, the broad corporate governance environment, the broad social and environmental concerns environment, the environment with respect to compensation. So you really have to think about what's going on out there, what's happening to your peers, and what could happen to you. Even if you're not as big as some of your peers, you need to sort of take a look at that and say, well, could this happen to me?
Okay, we're going to move on to the next segment. Now I'd like to talk to some of these issues, the other issues that have been big this proxy season, and have the two of you just give a quick hit in terms of what you think people need to be doing. First, let's start with succession planning and disclosures. What can companies do in that area?
Francis, you want to take the first shot at succession planning?
First shot at that. I think that companies should take a look both at what they're putting in the proxy with respect to management succession. It's been a big issue. Lots of companies, large companies, have had surprise leadership changes and then been sort of caught napping apparently at not being able to name either a brand new permanent CEO to succeed. So companies need to be able to try and describe that they have a process and that the board is on top of that. There are companies that also need to take a look at their director succession as well. Some companies where there are great many directors who are very, very long tenured, and some of them are at or over the retirement age, and they need to start planning for and describing how they're going to be bringing on new directors and what skill sets they're going to be looking for.
I agree with Francis. We recognize that it's a sensitive issue, and so people tend to tread gently, and that does make sense. But you do get to, and this is something where looking at the environment matters very much, because you continually, and it seems to be a surprise, to see how many companies are caught off guard by something that happens that causes a leadership change, a surprise leadership change, as Francis said, and they don't seem to be prepared for that. There are, of course, companies who are very good at this, who make this an entire process, and what they seem to do is sort of have a long-term list maybe and a short-term or emergency list, and there are different ways to do this so that you are not surprised, so that if for some reason there has to be a surprise management change, because that seems to be the one where people are caught most off guard, not necessarily the long-term, where you've had somebody in the works, but when there is for one reason or another a surprise leadership change. And maybe there's a short term, but instead of having to announce, we've now engaged these people to do a search for us, or this person's the interim for now until, and so it is something that makes a lot of news and not of a news that people like to see.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions about political contribution disclosures. Do we have any advice for our audience on that?
And what we're seeing now is shareholder proposals that are seeking political contribution disclosure and lobbying, in part because of the impact of the Citizens United decision, and also, of course, it being an election year. Those proposals, it's very early in the season. While they don't generally get majority, there's a sense they might get stronger support from sort of mainstream investors. And one thing to make clear is a lot of it's very focused on disclosure. Mainstream investors in particular don't want to control how you spend your political capital, but they want to know what your process is. Some of it's disclosure about process, especially board oversight, and the fact that there is actually board oversight and a process at the company on how these decisions are made. And there's a particular focus on political expenditures related to lobbying costs that come from payments to trade associations. How much of those fees and dues are for lobbying, in light of a lot of press about companies advocating for some, one position or another. So there are different institutions, Center for Political Accountability and other institutions that are trying to encourage companies to be more transparent about it. We're seeing some big companies take the lead and post things on their website that has a lot of detail and information. And it's an evolving area. There's a lot of examples to look at if it is something that people, your shareholders are interested in having you do as a company.
And absolutely, and there certainly can be some risk for some companies in not trying to at least develop, not necessarily agreeing with the proponents and doing everything that they've outlined in their proposals, but certainly being more transparent, putting some things up on the website about disclosure so as to forestall any potential consumer backlash that might possibly take place if the issue is if there's a prolonged battle with shareholders about the issue.
We have a question from our audience. What impact, if any, would the U.S. proxy access situation have on Canadian companies and their boards?
Well, having advised, been fortunate enough to advise some Canadian companies in the past. One thing I understand is that even if it doesn't have a direct impact, as in it doesn't apply to Canadian companies, some of the Canadian practices, which is more like a best practice kind of governance practice, they do borrow liberally from what they're seeing in the States. So this is, again, a situation where recognizing the environment in the States and what's developing as trends here is very important for being proactive and protective in Canada, because a lot of things tend to get carried over, of course, changed for the special circumstances in Canada, but the concepts tend to carry over in one form or another at some point.
I agree with that. It's also good to note that we were just talking about CEO succession and director succession, and there Canada is a little bit ahead with respect to how they disclose that type of information, and it's something that many U.S. companies had to sort of look at as there was a greater move in SEC requirements towards disclosure on those points. So there's some things that we can learn from our folks up in Canada.
Okay, we have another question. It's basically how can you get large shareholders to actually vote for your proposals?
The companies that do this well, I would say have really, pretty strong ongoing relationships with their large shareholders. And I don't mean necessarily IR with the analyst or with the investment analyst. I mean the governance people with the governance people at those large shareholders. They visit them in the off season. There are actually companies who do road trips. I don't think that's necessarily common, but that does exist. And they go out and visit the governance person at T. Rowe and BlackRock and Fidelity and Vanguard, or at least try to get them in. During the off season, they try to establish and develop those relationships, just so when during the immediacy of the season, when they pick up the phone and have to call those people, they can say, hi, we met last year and all that. I think those are companies that look at this not on a seasonal basis, but more as a year-round assignment to be proactive and to engage with their shareholders. And they tend to do a good job, not only just reaching these people, because I think that is an issue, just reaching these people when you need them, not only in reaching these people, but also in being more compelling and being more credible with these people.
I would agree with that, absolutely. There are companies that have, and many of those companies have learned because they've received shareholder proposals over the years, and now they've developed governance as a strategic focus. In some cases, they've developed internal teams with IR being involved, with the corporate secretary's office being involved, with legal being involved, and maybe some folks from financial or HR to be able to talk about comp. And they now have both not only road shows, but they can basically put together a phone call. Whether they need to have a director on it or not is another story. But they do a lot of outreach in the off-season, visits, phone calls, conference calls, in order to make sure that they have a strong relationship, and they identify the folks in the governance unit as opposed to just the folks that IR might identify through analysts or portfolio managers.
Well, folks, we are out of time. So that's going to do it for today's webinar, How Proactive Governance Can Protect You, Your Board, Your Company, and Your Brand. I want to take a minute to thank our speakers for today, Francis Bird, Senior Vice President and Corporate Governance Risk Practice Leader of Laurel Hill Advisory Group, and Ning Chu, Counsel at the law firm Davis Polk and Wardell. Thanks to Laurel Hill Advisory Group for their support of this event. And thank all of you for attending. Just as a reminder, this event has been recorded and will be available for you to revisit on our website within the next day or so. And when you visit, please check for the next in our series of Corporate Secretary Executive Briefing webinars. This is Matthew Scott, editor of Corporate Secretary, signing off.